All right, everyone. Welcome to Don't Be Scared of Facts, a presentation that's really designed to be your antidote to fear when it comes to some of these intimidating resources that contain data, stats that aren't really legal in nature, that are sort of outside of our comfort area as legal researchers, but can still be really useful to be familiar with. And this is going to hopefully get you to be a little more comfortable using data, using stats, using these types of studies. With the specific purpose of using them for your tort reform project for this class. So let's go ahead and get going. Let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Gerard Falk, not a scary guy at all. I'm the Instructional and Digital Services Librarian here at GSU. And if you have any questions, whether they're questions about this particular presentation and some of the content that's covered, or they're just a question about research or a question about legal research or the law, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I am happy to help you. My email is right there. That's the easiest way to contact me. So, just a quick roadmap of some of the topics that we're going to cover in this presentation. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of studies, the different types of articles and research that you're going to find out there, and some of the resources and tools that you will use for finding them. And our focus here is going to be on two fields that have a lot of relevance to the tort reform movement and the study of the effects of that movement. And those two fields are the field of medicine and the field of economics. Then we'll talk about some additional sources for data, for stats that are really useful for you to be familiar with. And then I will offer some thoughts on how you might go about evaluating this research, how you might go about thinking about the stats that you run across, and how you might gauge the quality of some of these articles that you find in your research. So, first things first, researching medicine. This is a complex field and can be a really intimidating one to research, even as a librarian. But it doesn't have to be a nightmare. Let's take some of that fear out of the equation. So you can really fit most of the medical studies that you'll run across into these two very broad categories. And the first one are observational studies. Uh, and this is a situation that is already happening out in the world. And then researchers are collecting data on something that they find to be interesting that is actually already occurring. They're not intervening in any way in that situation or event. They're just collecting that data in order to test some hypotheses that they have about why something is happening or how something might be affecting something else. And that's where it differs from your experimental studies, because in those studies, the researchers do intervene. For example, they may give some participants a drug or a certain type of treatment and then give others a placebo. That's an experiment for an experimental study. And the reason they do this is that it allows them to much better isolate the effect of that particular intervention in a much more concrete and convincing way. So, in general, your experimental studies are going to be considered to be much stronger evidence than studies that are more observational in nature. Now, you will run across a pretty wide variety of different kinds of specific studies, and we're not going to go over all of these in detail, but I do think this provides you with a helpful way to think about the different types of studies that you might encounter. To go ahead and try to situate it in the spectrum that runs from the strongest conclusions, the most experimental types of studies, all the way to the weaker conclusions and the more observational kinds of studies. So all the way from like a randomized controlled trial, which is kind of the gold standard, the gold standard of an experimental study where a group is randomly selected to receive a treatment and others randomly selected to receive that placebo, all the way to your most observational and anecdotal types of studies like case reports, which are essentially just a detailed history of something that happened to a relatively small number of individuals. Now, medical research is a little different than some other fields like economics, for example, in that one particular database does tend to really be easy to identify as like the key database, like the most essential database for finding medical research, and that is PubMed. PubMed provides access to the National Library of Medicine's database, which contains a whole lot of different journals, and it contains access to all of the citations and abstracts that are contained within that database. And of course, when you're accessing it through GSU and using the library's resources, you're going to be able to get full text for a lot of that stuff as well. Now, PubMed is a complex database, so you do have to be pretty conscious and intentional about the way that you use it in order to make effective use of what it has to offer. Now, the basic search functionality is really pretty much what you would expect. You could certainly just go to the search bar and put in the terms that you want to look up in there and run a basic keyword search. And then if you choose the advanced search options, you can do things like Boolean connectors, your and, or, not, things like that, and formulate a query, which can be a helpful way of maybe narrowing the results somewhat. But you've got some other really helpful tools that aren't taken advantage of quite as much as they could be, in my opinion. And the first one of those are your medical subject headings. And this is essentially like a controlled vocabulary that would allow you to really ensure that you're finding all of the particular studies that deal with a particular type of treatment or maybe a particular type of condition. By using a controlled vocabulary, you're making sure that you're going to capture all of those, even if some of the authors of the study might sometimes refer to it using slightly different terminology from paper to paper. It's not going to rely on that matching the keyword because you're using the controlled vocabulary of those medical subject headings. Next, we have another way of utilizing this database called clinical queries. And this is a specialized tool that allows you to locate particular types of studies, particular types of reviews. So if you're really looking for only these randomized trials, you could really focus your research to that end and only locate those instead of casting such a broad net in terms of the types of studies that you're looking at. And when it comes to this stuff, when it comes to using PubMed effectively, constructing effective searches, the main library has a really great research guide that I would encourage you to take advantage of. It contains some tutorial videos and a lot of information on how to use these different features and how to make sure you're really taking full advantage of everything this really powerful database has to offer.
So, with that in mind, let's get a little more hands on and take a look at that guide, take a look at PubMed, and see what it all really looks like in action. So, you can see that I've ran a Google search for GSU PubMed Research Guide. Pretty straightforward stuff, and as you would hope, it is my first result here. And you can see that we've got some basic information on the first page of the guide, along with a couple of librarians who are specialists in this area. And then we've got different tabs that can take us to different aspects of PubMed. So we've got a tab dedicated to basic PubMed searching that explains like some subject searching with controlled vocabularies, like I mentioned in that mesh subject headings context, a little bit of information about setting limits and different things like that, or setting filters, excuse me. And of course, we have a advanced search techniques to complement that, as well as a tab that's dedicated to those medical subject headings that I tried to emphasize in my slides. So yes, this is a great resource for getting a grasp on PubMed. Now let's take a look at PubMed itself. So just looking at like the front page of PubMed here, I think that it is a type of organization, a type of format that you're probably pretty familiar with. You see this search bar here that you can use to like enter the keywords that you want to find medical studies, clinical trials on here, and then you can actually choose this advanced link to create a more sophisticated search, like by specifying different fields, like if you know that you want to focus on like a particular journal or a particular mesh subject heading. There are a lot of different modifiers there. That's not really the main thing I want to focus on, though. But very similar to what you see in other databases with search utility. Now, below that, we have some really great resources under Learn that can help you to become acquainted with the different features available on PubMed. We have some finding tools here, as well as some APIs and different things like that that can help researchers use the resource effectively. And then we have this Explore heading here where we find the mesh subject headings database. And that's really what I want to take a closer look at. So let's click on that. And here we are. We're at a page where we can search not PubMed itself, but we can search this subject headings database to be sure that we're running a search that is targeted towards whichever condition or treatment or aspect of medicine that we want to focus on, and that we're including all of the relevant studies because researchers have decided that these studies fit under that subject heading, but we're excluding all of that irrelevant stuff that might clog up our search results if we chose a more general set of search terms. So one thing I'd like to focus your attention on first, though, is the availability of these great help resources, especially these tutorials. So let me just open that up in a new link. And this, of course, is not the only place where you might be able to find tutorials on PubMed. There are a lot of great ones on YouTube as well. But what I do really like about the way they have this set up is that you've got a lot of PubMed video tutorials that focus really on one single aspect or one single skill or one single feature and are very short or very concise. So you can very quickly watch the video, get acclimated to what you're trying to do, and then try to use that in your research. So, don't hesitate, don't neglect to take advantage of these great resources that are available as far as just getting help with using the website. All right, back to the mesh subject headings page. And I'm going to run a search, and I'm going to run a search for something that I think is really, everyone's primary focus this time of year. So that is, of course, candy. All right, so I ran a search for candy. I got 2 results. I'm not sure what this second one is all about, but the first one looks pretty close to what I had in mind. These sweet confections that we love so much, Snickers and Reese's Cups and all of that good stuff. So let's choose that. With a quick summary of what they mean by this candy terminology. Some of these subheadings, which we're going to come back to in just a moment. Then we see some entry terms, and these are basically almost like synonyms or terms that kind of fall under the same general umbrella. You can use these terms like confections to navigate to the same subheading page if you put them in the mesh search bar. And below that, we have this kind of tree or outline. And the folks over at the National Library of Medicine have taken all of their medical studies and clinical trials, all of that information that is available in this amazing database that is PubMed, and they've organized it according to subject to make it easier to navigate, to make it easier to find what you're really looking for. And here we can see how that knowledge is arranged and where this candy subheading fits within this overall tree of knowledge. We can see that it's a subset of food. That makes sense. And below that, it looks like there are some more specific headings that deal with like chewing gum, nicotine chewing gum, and that makes sense. That's a therapy for folks who want to quit smoking. So it stands to reason there will be a lot of studies on that, and it would have its own sort of prominent subject heading. So that can be helpful if we just want to get an idea of how we could make our search a little more general, maybe, or even a little more specific. But one really helpful tool that kind of works in the same vein are these subheadings. So let's say that we were only really interested in the supply and distribution of candy and maybe the toxicity of candy. So I'm going to choose those two subheadings. And then I'm going to choose Add to Search Builder, because you do need to keep in mind that PubMed itself, this isn't the page that you would use to search that. You would go to the front page of PubMed that we started on. But the way this tool is set up, this mesh subject heading tool, is it allows you to very easily build a search that you can then use to search PubMed. So you can see that it's created some search string that incorporates this focus on the supply of candy and the toxicity of candy. And then you have the ability to use that search string to actually search PubMed. Okay, so here we see that we got 13 results. And, depending on how many results you get, that might cause you to think about tailoring your search queries more finely, or maybe choosing a more general approach if you haven't found as many studies as you would prefer. If you found a pretty good chunk of studies, you might want to consider using some of these different filters to narrow it further into the precise type of study that you're looking for. So you have some choices as far as choosing the publication dates that you want to filter to, as well as the different types of studies that you can find on PubMed. I mentioned the meta-analysis and systematic review. Focusing on those studies initially can be a really good place to start, since they tend to summarize a lot of other studies and can give you a great background on the research that has been done on a particular topic. Just a little pro tip there. So let's go ahead and just take a look at this presence of candy and snack food at checkout in chain stores article that we see second in our search results. And we have the article pulled up, not that different from what you've seen in other types of scholarly resources. These abstracts are very helpful. Don't ignore the abstract, because it gives you a quick summary of what the study was all about and what it found. And then below it, we see some similar articles, and this is a great feature of PubMed, and I do find that these often tend to be pretty relevant. I think just looking at these, we can see that they seem to be pretty on point as far as the supply of candy. And if you find one good study, one good clinical trial that's relevant to what you're trying to research, looking at these similar articles can allow you to find more that look quite similar to that study. And another kind of often overlooked research resource that you have on almost any article that you look at on PubMed is this cited by section here, because these are all the journals that have cited the article that you're looking at. So if you've decided this candy store article was highly relevant to your tort reform research, maybe, uh, then you might want to look at these additional studies which have kind of built upon the research of this one. And then scrolling back up to the top here, we can see that we do have a link to the full text. And most of the time, if you're on campus or you are connected to the VPN, which you should download for this reason, you can click on the link to that full text. And if GSU collects that journal, it will take you right to it. If it doesn't connect you to it or it doesn't seem like we own that journal, touch base with one of the librarians because we can almost always get these resources for you. You should certainly never think about paying for a journal article. We have great tools for getting that type of stuff. So that is kind of your whirlwind tour of PubMed. Really, just a quick look at a few of its features, a few highlights that might be helpful in your research. There really is a lot to PubMed. So it is the type of thing where if you're going to use it frequently, dedicating some time to mastering it can be quite helpful.
So, our next topic is researching economics. And here we have a wider variety of different sources that we want to look at, that we want to be familiar with. Uh, but we also want to take a step back and look at some of these broader categories of studies as well. And there's going to be some overlap with what we saw in the medical field. Uh, like we saw that there are some examples of meta analysis within the medical field as well. It's a really common type of study in the economics field that uses uh, these different stat methodologies to take evidence from all these different studies, all these different sources, and synthesize that evidence and try to draw conclusions from it. And then we also have experiments within the economic context. This is frequently going to take the form of like a natural experiment, which is actually more kind of like an observational type of study using the vocabulary from the medical context. But sometimes these also take place out in the field or within a controlled lab. They might use cash payments to incentivize people so that the researchers can take a look at the choices that those people make and draw some conclusions from those. And finally, you'll also run across these empirical studies. And I think you'll know when you run into these because they can often be very difficult to read if you're not trained in the discipline. And these are going to test like a complex a theoretical model of some kind by using a data set and using various methodologies of stats, such as complicated regression analysis, to try to test the validity of that model when applied to that particular data. And I don't think in general these are going to come in quite as handy when you're looking at it in the tort reform context. Um, but when you're looking at those, you'll probably mainly just be looking at some of the conclusions and not so much diving deep into these complex mathematical models that are being tested. So when you're looking for economics research, uh, again, just like we saw with the medical field, there is sort of one database that really reigns over the rest of them. And in economics, that's going to be EconLit. It has a really almost comprehensive database of econ literature, with its emphasis really being on articles that you'll find in these peer reviewed journals. So that would probably be your first place to turn for most of your research. But you also might want to look at some of the working papers that are made available by NBER, this private nonprofit that really gets a lot of the most important work in scholarship out there to the public, like as it's being done. So it's going to be a little more recent, a little more fresh off the presses, contain some developments that haven't necessarily went through that peer review process yet. So in that sense, they might be a little less rigorous or a little less convincing. And finally, another really solid resource is the Public Affairs Information Service. And this indexes a really wide variety of materials that concern public policy. So it covers many different disciplines as long as they affect public policy or matters that might be, uh, uh, subject to government regulation or something along those lines for whatever reason. So it's got a variety of different materials in different disciplines, but they're also going to cover different formats. So you do find, sort of standard studies, scholarly articles, but you'll also find things like, government statistics and that type of information as well. It's really quite a different quite a variety of different information there. So with that in mind, uh, you'll want to use some of your filtering options to make sure you're narrowing it to what you can get. And these are all databases that you'll be able to find just through the GSU library databases page. Another thing that you should have on your radar when it comes to thinking about economics research are these key economic indicators, which you can often use the websites that I have linked here to look at on a narrower geographic level or through a different demographic lens. So you'll have some options for filtering that data and visualizing it. And these were things like, the GDP, which you hear a lot about on the news, as well as different reports on employment, wages, prices, consumer expenditures. These can be really helpful sources of data, especially when you're trying to look at the effects of something as wide scale, as widespread as tort reform, something that can have such dramatic effects. And then we have sort of our own subfield, right, of law and economics that is really often related to analyzing the economic effects of different forms of law, which of course has a lot of prominence when we're talking about tort reform. And this doesn't really have like its own dedicated sources, so you're going to find these different books, like in just the library stacks alongside other books in the legal field. You'll find the journals uh, alongside, other legal journals. Generally, I have some of the major ones listed here. Uh, and I've just pulled out a few different titles that would provide you with kind of a nice introduction to some of the key concepts of law and economics. We start out with our economic analysis of law by Judge Posner, which is one of the really landmark books in the field of law and economics. And then we have, some handbooks on the major topics when we're talking about the Oxford Handbook, as well as a research specific handbook into behavioral law and economics. One thing to note about this one in particular is that, we have several of these that are on law and economics, particularly. So we have this one on behavioral law and economics, but also a few others that deal with like the economics of property law and different more specialized topics like that as well. So these might be some good places to turn if like you're really attracted to the economical aspect of this type of stuff, and you feel that the sort of analytical framework provided by law and economics provides like a good vantage point to what you're trying to look at. That's just a few resources that have a little bit of everything in them. The first one is ProQuest, and the second one is EBSCOhost. And these are two sources. Again, these are going to be found through the main campus libraries page of databases. And these aggregate a whole bunch of different resources, a whole bunch of databases from many, many different disciplines that contain many different types of articles and things to the point where they can be a little overwhelming to use. Um, but they contain all these different databases and they pull them all together and allow you to just search them all at once. Uh, This isn't always the most effective way to use them. Sometimes you'll want to start out by trying to filter things down and narrow the sources you're searching a little bit before you sort of undertake the proverbial wild goose chase. But these can be a helpful place to turn if you're just not finding anything in sort of the usual places that you would look. Uh, Although I would caution, we did emphasize PubMed in terms of medical research, and I don't think either of these is really going to capture much of what's available in the medical field in a way that's in any way comparable to what you would find with PubMed. Now, we also have some other kind of more general sources of stats, like the historical statistics of the United States, which contains a lot of quantitative facts of American history. They're all cross referenced, they're all indexed, got a lot of easily searchable tables with documentation, coverage of topics like migration, health, crime, things like that. It's a really useful source. And then we've got the Statistical Abstract of the United States, which is a really comprehensive collection of stats on social, political, economic conditions. It's really well known among researchers. That's one really nice thing about it. People will know exactly what you're talking about. And it's really highly valued. These are some really good stats. Again, you can find this and use it through the university library, as with pretty much all of these sources. And then another one that most people are at least somewhat familiar with are the source, or this the data that you can get through the Census Bureau. And we've got a really useful platform for navigating that called the Social Explorer that you can also utilize through the library's database list. And then we have these other sources that are a little more oriented towards visualizing data. And of course, it's not like a bright line from one type of source of stats to another. Some of the compilations contain graphs and tables as well. But these data visualization sources are really focused much more on giving you a variety of different ways to visualize data. So Policy Map is this great data slash mapping tool that allows academic institutions like GSU to access data about communities, about markets across the US. And you can use it for research, for business planning, site selection, impact analysis, because it's got a wide array of different stats and different data that you can look at in terms of these geographic maps. The next one is Simply Analytics, which has over 75,000 different variables covering a lot of different demographic, historical census data, real estate data, housing data, employment, consumer spending data, everything under the sun, really. A lot of healthcare survey data as well, so it could be handy in that respect, as well as marketing data, and it allows you to look at that data in different formats and different and visualize it in different ways that would benefit your analysis. Finally, Census on the Map allows you to access like the Census Bureau's own data visualization tools, the interactive mapping tools that let you see how some of the stuff they've collected on the US population looks like from a geographic level when you're looking at a certain geographic area, like the state of Georgia, exactly how that data overlays with our different geographic subdivisions. All right, our next major topic is how to evaluate some of these different sources that we might come across. So, first, just a word about just being illiterate when it comes being literate when it comes to stats. Many people are kind of intimidated by numbers, myself included sometimes, depending on the context. But we want to make sure that we're comfortable with that when we're evaluating these sources. And these are just a few common mistakes that you might run into that you want to be on the lookout for when you're trying to evaluate the research that you come across, and also errors to perhaps watch out for in your own thinking. And the first are these issues with probability. Like it's really tough to understand probability. So, a few questions that you might want to ask when you're thinking about the probability of different events is number one, exactly what are they referring to? What is the category uh, of patients that might uh, stand that percentage chance of like developing so and so condition. Is it the whole population or just the population under age 50? That's a really important distinction that you need to be able to grasp and that you need to do via like careful reading of the way that the methodology of that study is set out so that you have a clear understanding of the reference categories so you don't mess up like that attendant probability. Uh, Another important like probability related issue that often comes up is like the independence of different events. Are the two events that you're looking at actually totally independent from one another? Or are they tied together on some really fundamental level that makes like the probability of one event affect like a subsequent event? Next, we have causation problems. And of course, we all know sort of the axiomatic proverbial, causation does not equal correlation. And it really is uh, something to take home, to take to the bank, because that is definitely true and definitely a good thing to keep in mind when you're evaluating stats and any type of data. Uh, but a sort of more inclusive way to put that same kind of basic idea is that you don't want to mistake like an inference that you can make from data, that you can make from stats, and see that as like a deterministic, inevitable type of causation. Because the two are really, not the same thing. One is what's likely to happen, and another is like when this happens, this next thing inevitably follows. We're really talking about uh, very different concepts, but they're very easy to confuse and they cause a lot of problems when it comes to stats, data, and stuff like that. Next, we have like sample size issues. Is it a super small sample? Does it appear to be biased in its composition? It's definitely one problem that you run into very commonly, and one thing that you'll want to consider when evaluating the different studies that you encounter. And finally, issues of interpretation. So you don't want to make conclusions that go beyond your data. And one way to ensure that you avoid that is to acknowledge the uncertainty that attends all of this. Like stats are all about probability, they're all about likelihood, they're all about painting a picture with the data. There's not a lot of certainty when we're talking about stats. It's mostly uncertainty. And the more that that's really integrated, that recognition is integrated into your analysis, the better it's going to be, the stronger it's going to be. Just one variety of that that comes up a lot is when you take results that apply to one certain population, people over age 50, and you end up extrapolating that and applying it to a broader population, maybe everyone or all adults, than the one that you actually studied and got the specific data on. So make sure that you realize, those results are really going to be a lot more convincing if they're applied to the to the actual participants in the study as opposed to the population writ large. But more than any of that, I mean, there are a lot of errors that you can make with numbers and stats, but a really common thing and sort of a broad overarching theme to how you should think about stats is that we're not just thinking about the math skills that you need to have to understand some of this data, to understand this info, but we're also thinking about how and when this occurs. We're thinking about the social context of the data because that's really going to tell us a lot about how it should be interpreted. And that's a important element of thinking about the research that you find that often kind of gets left out of the equation because it just seems so much less precise and quantitative, but it's so important, so important. Okay, so we talked about some specific concerns when it comes to evaluating uh, data, when it comes to evaluating stats and some of the errors that we've run across. But what about evaluating research just more generally? So we're just kind of going to go piece by piece, looking at the different parts of an article that you run into. Of course, the first one is always the abstract. We're skipping here in this PowerPoint, but it is something that you should pay close attention to. It provides you with a quick way to get a sense of what a study or article is about overall and just quickly situate it within the context of your research overall. But if you need even more purpose, even more context, the introduction is always going to help to tell you, what the state of the field is, what the current literature looks like, the purpose of the article overall. Significantly, it's also going to clue you in on what the hypothesis is. So you really need to make special note of that in order to fully understand an article. And then next, you want to make sure you really carefully read over and understand the methodology. You want to ask yourself questions like, is there a key variable that will really seem to affect the outcome of the study that just isn't present here in the methodology? Uh, how does this particular method compare to the methods that you've seen in similar articles? So, on one level, your ability to evaluate a particular article is really going to depend on you reading a little more widely than that so that you better have like a baseline provided in these different articles, which you can compare the methodology to and see how that methodology differences in it might compare some of the differences in results that you might run across. And that brings us to results. So, first and most obviously, you'll want to ask yourself, how does that result actually relate to the initial hypothesis? One other thing to keep in mind that sometimes students will skip over when assessing research are the different charts and graphs that are often featured to display those results, to display that data, which could be really helpful in developing an understanding of it. Finally, discussion, conclusion. And here, I really think you want to be focused on the connection between these sort of big picture takeaways uh, that the authors are going to present, and the connection between those and the actual hard data that you found that the results indicated. Because sometimes you'll find that the connection between the two is a little tenuous, and that some of those errors that we saw when we talked about stats and the different problems that are often present when we discuss those are going to really come up in this conclusion section where perhaps the conclusions, the takeaways, the insights are just a little overbroad compared to some of these results and are the result of taking results from a certain population, sort of extrapolating to a whole society or a population writ large. So that's just a few specific concerns related to evaluating clinical trials, specifically when you're doing research on the medicine side of things. So, this is really where our observational versus experimental divide is the most helpful. So, you'll want to refer to the different types of studies on that earlier slide that are out there and sort of where they fall along that sort of spectrum of the more observational and the generally less rigorous or less convincing to the more experimental and the more rigorous, the more convincing, our randomized controlled trials and similar types of studies. So that'll be one initial consideration that'll help you decide how persuasive, how convincing that particular research is to you. Another important thing to ask yourself is, are all of the results actually even included? This will often be will be mentioned in either the conclusion, or excuse me, either the results or the methodology. They'll discuss if perhaps there was some error with part of the experiment or something that confounded the results and meant that they had to exclude some of them from the final results. And often that can really have a pretty big impact on the takeaway, can really maybe limit the usefulness of a particular clinical trial. So, one thing to really keep in mind there. Finally, the confidence interval. That's very frequently going to be like 95% is going to be the most common one that you run across. And if you see something that's really off that mark or has a much lower confidence interval, that's really a big, uh, 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 you know, yellow sign, a caution sign for you to uh, to to be suitably wary of that research if like they don't feel that it's really statistically significant. So when we're thinking about these clinical trials, some practitioners in the field have come up with a sort of acronymic method that you can use to think about some of these things, that many of them that we just went over in some form or fashion. But this will give you a more sort of systematic way to go through them. So, think about the problem that the research is trying to address, the population that the study is actually being done on that are participating in the study, the demographics of that population, the nature of the intervention that is actually being studied, any types of comparisons that are being done as part of that intervention. How is the control group being compared to the experimental group, and so on. The overall outcome, the results of that intervention, what happened, the number of subjects that participated in the trial, and then the statistics, the data that actually uh, uh, was the result of the experiment. So these are all sort of boxes that you can kind of check off and make sure to look for and think about when you're trying to evaluate these clinical trials specifically. So that wraps it up. We talked about different types of studies in the medicine field as well as in the field of economics. Uh, some resources that you can use for finding those studies, uh, as well as some good resources for more general stats and data, as well as some tools and frameworks that you can use for evaluating the quality and rigor of the research that you find. I do think this should be stuff that is quite helpful to you in doing some research on the effects of tort reform for your course. If you have any questions about any of the material that we covered, you've got my contact information here. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And remember, this stuff, it's not scary. It's not terrifying. It's data. You can master it. You've got to take the fear out of the equation and just get a little more comfortable with these types of resources. And yeah, there you go. Good luck with it. Let me know if you need anything.